returned to the quiet New England town of Ashwick, a place where what people have learned to accept as the inevitable may never really have happened at all. Thomas Martin, undertaker by trade and genealogist by obsession, spent his lifetime fixating on death. He cataloged the dead, measured them, and researched them with precision. He understood death to be a fixed point, a finality, an absolute conclusion. However, what Martin had failed to consider is that, while he was studying the dead were also studying him. As things often do in small New England towns, places where stone fences remain standing as reminders of generations past, today's episode begins with an air of suspicion. Next door, Jim and Kathy Holbrook, Martin's neighbors, had been watching him for some time. First, the Thanksgiving dinner, a meal that ended with 5 deaths, simultaneous, unexplained, uninvestigated. The delivery of 37 headstones to Martin's backyard. At first they tried to dismiss it, attributing it to Martin's eccentricity. After all, Martin was in the business of arranging for funerals. But 37 markers arranged in a private backyard in a residential neighborhood had a way of lingering in their minds. Regular family gatherings for the dead, where Martin was the only attendee. Then came the digging, the removal of coffins that no one had buried, and last but not least, the recent delivery of 5 additional headstones. Jim and Kathy Martin stopped speculating. They began documenting, and by the time they filed their report about Martin with the Ashwick Police Department, their concern had hardened into something closer to paranoia. The police did not ignore patterns. They did not ignore neighbors who spoke in hushed tones about graveyards where lawns should be. And they certainly, given the totality of evidence before them, could no longer turn a blind eye on 5 deaths occurring simultaneously under one roof. After his meeting with the Holbrooks, Detective Miller from the Ashwick Police Department called Thomas Martin. Their exchange was polite, professional, and routine. Miller requested that Martin come to the police station for an interview to discuss zoning bylaws, burial practices, and the circumstances surrounding his family's passing. But the file did not make its final stop on Miller's desk. He forwarded it to the county coroner's office for review, for investigation, for answers. In a different corner of this jigsaw puzzle of death and deception, Thomas Martin could not take his mind off what he saw on his trip to the Harborview Cemetery. His discovery that the dates of death on his grandparents' headstones were gone, with no trace of worldly interference, intrigued him, and now he demanded a fact-finding expedition. Martin called Harold Finch, the same gravedigger that excavated his yard over a year ago. Martin told Finch that he needed him to travel up the coast to the Harborview Cemetery to excavate his grandparents' graves. Finch was reluctant to continue the conversation. He paused and then asked Martin 2 very practical questions. How deep? And to him, more importantly, how much are you going to pay me? Martin's answer to the latter question persuaded Finch. $2,000 in cash, said Martin. The offer was enough to justify Finch's inconvenience. It also took a step in the right direction to further satisfy Finch's curiosity about the strange goings-on in Martin's backyard. Finch agreed to take the assignment. Martin gave Finch precise instructions to follow. Nightfall, no machinery, no witnesses, no trace. And so, beneath the sky of a new moon, that night Finch traveled to the Harborview Cemetery and began to dig. The soil was softer than expected, as though it had already been disturbed. 6 feet down, he stopped. There was no resistance, no wood, no metal, no coffin, only emptiness, a hole that everyone believed once held a casket, now did not. He moved to the second grave. The result was identical. 2 graves, 2 absences, 2 confirmations of something that were beyond Finch's comprehension. He began to backfill the holes, quickly, methodically, as though he was engaging in both a figurative and a literal cover-up in the same moment. But the fact remained. Other than emptiness, There was nothing there to cover. That was when he heard voices approaching. A man's voice called out, "Evening!" Finch froze. 2 Harborview police officers stood behind him, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "We receive reports from neighbors," one officer said. The second officer chimed in and said, "Reports that someone was up here." Finch looked over at the shovel in his hand, at the disturbed earth, and at the graves he had opened and closed. There was no explanation that would sound reasonable, so he said nothing. The officers arrested him and detained him overnight. By morning, Harold Finch was arraigned in court. "Grave robbing," said the magistrate, a charge that suggested theft, but there had been nothing to steal. Finch declined a public defender. There was nothing to defend. Released on his own recognizance, he returned to Ashwick that afternoon, knowing that in the very near future, he would be coming back to Harborview to face judgment. Finch headed straight to Martin's mortuary and recounted everything that transpired: the digging, the emptiness, the arrest, the charge, the judge, the release. Martin listened, but not to the parts that mattered to Finch, not to the consequences Finch faced, not to the law, only to one detail. "Did you bring back the caskets?" Martin asked. Finch shook his head and delivered the news. There were no caskets. Martin nodded. He was not surprised. He was not disturbed. As Finch exited, Martin uttered, "Confirmed." And now it is time for us to take a brief respite and listen to an intermezzo conceived by world-renowned composer E. Dudek, after which the saga of Thomas Martin will resume. We continue. Elsewhere in Ashwick, at the home of Emily Westbrook, another knot began to tighten. Emily had built her reputation on the idea that the dead did not speak. They lingered and could be interpreted, but they never could be heard. It was a fact she had repeated to her clients with unwavering certainty, until the afternoon her cell phone rang. It was one of her clients, Melissa Casey. Melissa's voice trembled, not with grief, but with something far less familiar: confusion. "I got a text message," she said. Emily listened intently. "It was from a number I don't know." Melissa repeated the number, and Emily wrote it down. The text message asked 2 questions. The first, "How are you?" The second, "Are the children doing okay in school?" Emily closed her eyes. The next words out of Melissa's mouth came slowly. The text message closed with, "Love, Mark." Mark was Melissa's husband, a firefighter, a tragic death. "I've been trying to reach him," Melissa said. Melissa asked Emily, "Can this really be happening? Is Mark reaching out to me?" Emily said nothing because there was nothing in her practice that accounted for this. There was no seance, no ritual, no invocation. However, Emily was keenly aware that Mark's headstone was placed in Martin's backyard as part of the, quotes, experiment. Then Melissa added something else. There was another recipient on the text. Emily felt something shift. Who? She asked. The man's name was Thomas Martin. Emily played dumb. She did not mention the headstone. She did not mention the yard. She did not mention the experiment. Instead, she ended the call and immediately placed a call to Thomas Martin. When he answered, she told him everything. The message, the words, the name, the fact that he was the second recipient on the text received by Melissa. Then she shared the phone number with him. There was a pause, not of confusion, but of recognition. The same number, Martin said. Emily felt the ground beneath her assumptions begin to fracture. What does that mean? She asked. Martin's answer came without hesitation. It means the experiment is working. Night fell, and with it came the final convergence. Thomas Martin sat alone in his morgue. Outside, the 42 headstones marked a boundary that no longer existed. Beside him, unopened coffins waited, not as evidence, but as participants. His phone vibrated. Again, the same number, always the same number. Another text. It read, "We know what you did. Why did you do it?" Martin stared at the screen. This was different. Not observational, not just curious, but accusatory. Spoken as a collective. We. His response was uncharacteristically defensive. "Know what? What are you talking about?" The reply came back as it always did. Message undeliverable. The silence that followed was not empty. It was occupied, because somewhere beyond the reach of his instruments, beyond the scope of his experiment, the dead were no longer passive. They were aware. They were communicating again, with him and about him. And now, through some mechanism he had unknowingly activated, they were reaching beyond their boundary, into his life and the lives of others, Melissa, her children, Emily, Finch, and anyone else whose name had been carved into his carefully constructed field of headstones. Thomas Martin believed himself to be an architect and an observer, the one who defined the parameters of life and death. But in the quiet spaces between the messages, in the undeliverable replies, in the graves that no longer held their occupants, a different truth had begun to emerge. He had not created a bridge, he had exposed one. And on the other side of that bridge, something had noticed. Something or someone who remembered. Someone who asked questions, not questions of science, but of accountability. Because the dead, as Thomas Martin was now beginning to understand, did not require permission to continue their existence. They required respect. And when that respect was broken, they did not remain silent. They responded, not with footsteps, not with shadows, but with something far more precise. Communication, one way and becoming increasingly more personal. Somewhere beyond the finality of stone and soil, a conversation had begun, not about death, but about Thomas Martin. A man who had mistaken control for understanding. A man who was now learning that the line of communication between the living and the dead could be reopened by crossing from one platform to the next at the Conflation Station.